The cabin of Flight 802 fell into a deathly silence, the kind that usually precedes a crash. But they were still on the tarmac. Captain Grant Miller, a man whose ego occupied more space than the fuselage, stood red-faced in the aisle, pointing a trembling finger at the quiet man in seat 1A. "I don't care who he claims to be." Miller spat his voice, echoing off the overhead bins. "I want him off my plane, now! I will not fly with trash in first class." He thought he was exerting dominance. He thought he was protecting the prestige of his airline. He had no idea that the man he was calling trash wasn't just a passenger. He was the one man with the power to ground Miller for life. When the badge finally came out, the color didn't just leave the captain's face. It vanished, leaving behind the pale, hollow look of a man watching his own career go up in flames. The grandeur of JFK's Terminal 4 was lost on David Mercer. At 55, David had walked through more airports than most people had visited grocery stores. The polished terrazzo floors, the endless parade of duty-free luxury, and the frantic energy of travelers rushing toward their gates were all just background noise to him. Today, however, the noise felt particularly abrasive. David adjusted the strap of his worn leather duffel bag, a bag that had seen better days, much like the faded navy hoodie and loose-fitting jeans he wore. He looked nothing like the typical clientele for Vista Sky's premier transatlantic service to London Heathrow. He looked tired. He looked weathered. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man who might have wandered into the wrong line. But David wasn't lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. "Boarding pass, sir?" The gate agent asked, her smile tight and practiced. She paused for a fraction of a second as she took in his attire, her eyes flicking to the priority lane sign and back to him. It was a microaggression David was used to. He didn't react. He simply held out his phone. The scanner beeped a confirming green. Seat 1A. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone shifting slightly, though the confusion remained in her eyes. "Enjoy your flight." David nodded and walked down the jet bridge. He wasn't here for the champagne or the lie-flat seats, though his back certainly appreciated the latter. He was on a ghost ride. As a senior federal aviation safety inspector, David Mercer was the boogeyman of the airline industry. He didn't announce his visits. He didn't wear a suit with a government pin on the lapel. He bought tickets like a regular passenger, boarded like a regular passenger, and watched. He watched everything. He watched how the crew communicated, how they handled stress, and whether safety protocols were being followed or treated as mere suggestions. Today he was specifically interested in Captain Grant Miller. Vista Skies had a pristine safety record on paper, but the anonymous tip line at the regional field office had been lighting up for months regarding Miller. The reports were consistent, creating a hostile cockpit environment, disregarding crew input and exhibiting signs of extreme fatigue and aggression. In aviation, a God complex wasn't just a personality flaw. It was a fatality waiting to happen. David stepped onto the aircraft. The air was cool and smelled faintly of sanitized leather and coffee. "Welcome aboard," said a flight attendant, a young woman with a name tag reading Sarah. She offered a warm, genuine smile that didn't falter when she saw his clothes. "Let me help you find your seat." "I think I've got it, thanks," David said softly, his voice a deep, rumbling baritone. He slid his duffel into the overhead bin above 1A and settled into the expansive leather seat. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling a long breath. It had been a grueling week of hearings in D.C., and he was looking forward to a few hours of silence before the real work began. He pulled a pair of noise-cancelling headphones from his pocket, but didn't put them on yet. He needed to hear the boarding process. From the cockpit, the door was currently open. The pilots were going through their pre-flight checks. David could hear the murmur of voices, one calm, one sharp and agitated. "I told operations I wanted the fuel load checked twice." "Ben," a voice snapped. It was loud, abrasive. That had to be Captain Miller. "These ground crews are lazy. If we're heavy, I want to know before we push back, not when we're rotating." "The load sheet is signed off Grant," a softer voice replied, likely First Officer Ben Reynolds. "Fuel is spot on." "I'll be the judge of that," Miller grumbled. David opened one eye. He could see the captain now stepping out of the cockpit to grab a bottle of water from the galley. Grant Miller looked every bit the part of the classic aviator, tall, silver-haired jawline, like a cliff edge, his uniform pressed to military precision. He moved with an air of absolute ownership. Miller's eyes swept the first-class cabin, checking the load. It was half full. A tech CEO in 2F, a wealthy elderly couple in 3A and 3B, and David. Miller's gaze stopped on seat 1A. He froze. David didn't look away. He held the captain's gaze with a neutral, bored expression. Miller stared for a beat too long, his brow furrowing in distaste. He turned sharply to Sarah, who was arranging pre-flight beverages on a tray. "Sarah," Miller barked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Come here." Sarah flinched slightly, but hurried over to the galley entrance, just a few feet from where David sat. "Yes, Captain." "Who is that?" Miller jerked his head toward David, making no effort to be subtle. "That's Mr. Mercer, Captain. Seat 1A. Is he a non-rev? Is he staff?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Non-rev passengers, airline employees flying for free, were subject to a strict dress code. "No, Captain. He's a revenue passenger. Full fare." Miller scoffed, looking back at David with open contempt. "Full fare. Look at him. He looks like he slept in a dumpster. Are you sure he didn't sneak in from economy while you weren't looking? I checked his boarding pass myself, Captain. He's in the correct seat." Miller narrowed his eyes. "He doesn't belong here. It lowers the standard of the cabin. Vista Sky's first class is about elegance, Sarah. We're not a Greyhound bus." David heard every word. He didn't move. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the safety card, studying it with feigned interest. Internally, his mental notepad was already filling up. Unprofessional conduct. Disparaging passengers within earshot. Distracted from pre-flight duties by trivialities. "Captain, we're boarding in 5 minutes," Sarah said gently, trying to de-escalate. "He's not bothering anyone." "He's bothering me," Miller muttered. He turned back to the cockpit, but not before shooting one last glare at David. "Keep an eye on him. If he causes one issue, he's off." David turned the page of the safety card. Strike one, Captain, he thought. The boarding process continued. Economy passengers shuffled past, glancing enviously at the spacious seats in the front. The cabin filled up. The atmosphere was generally calm, the soft jazz music playing over the PA system, doing its best to soothe the nerves of 300 people about to be hurled through the sky in a metal tube. David remained quiet. He accepted a glass of water from Sarah, thanking her politely. He noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Miller's aggression had clearly rattled the crew. 20 minutes before scheduled departure, the trouble began. David took his phone out to check a final email. It was a standard smartphone, slightly cracked screen. Nothing fancy. As he typed, he shifted in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position for his bad hip, a souvenir from a crash investigation in the Andes 10 years prior. Captain Miller emerged from the cockpit again. He wasn't doing a visual check of the wings. He was standing at the front of the cabin, arms crossed, watching the passengers. This was highly irregular. Usually, pilots were busy with the FMC flight management computer at this stage. Miller walked down the aisle, stopping right next to David's seat. He loomed over him. "Sir," Miller said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a challenge. David looked up, removing his headphones. "Yes." "You need to stow that bag properly," Miller said, pointing to the duffel in the overhead bin. The bin was closed. "I believe it is stowed," David said calmly. "I saw you shove it in there." Miller lied. "It looked heavy. If that bin pops open during turbulence, it's a hazard, and frankly, it looks like it smells." The couple in row 3 gasped quietly. The tech CEO in 2F lowered his iPad to watch. David kept his voice even. "The bag fits within the dimensions, Captain, and the latch is secure. I checked it." "I don't care what you checked," Miller snapped. "I am the captain of this vessel. My word is law. I want that bag checked into the hold. It's too big for the cabin." "It contains my medication and fragile equipment," David said. "I'm allowed to keep it with me." Miller's face reddened. He wasn't used to pushback. To him, this man was an anomaly, a stain on his perfect flight deck environment. He saw a man who looked poor, who looked different, and he assumed he had no power. "I don't think you understand." Miller leaned in, invading David's personal space. "I decide what stays and what goes. And right now I'm deciding that you are becoming a problem." "I'm sitting quietly, Captain," David said, his eyes hardening. "The only one creating a disturbance is you." The silence in the cabin was absolute now. Even the jazz music seemed to fade away. Miller straightened up, laughing incredulously. He turned to the cabin, gesturing at David. "Did you hear that insubordination? On my plane." He turned back to David. "Let me see your boarding pass again." "I already showed it to the gate agent and the flight attendant. And now you're going to show it to me." David sighed. He reached into his pocket and produced the phone again, displaying the QR code. Miller snatched the phone from David's hand. "Hey," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "Give that back." Miller looked at the screen, scrolling through the ticket details. "David Mercer, one way. Paid in cash at the counter." He looked up, a triumphant sneer on his face. "That's a red flag if I ever saw one. Drug runners pay in cash. Who are you really?" "I am a passenger who paid for a ticket," David said, standing up. He was almost as tall as Miller, but broader in the shoulders. "And you are crossing a line, Captain. You are profiling me, and you are delaying this flight." "Sit down," Miller roared. Sarah rushed forward. "Captain, please." "Quiet, Sarah," Miller shouted, making her jump. "This man is aggressive. He stood up to a flight crew member. That is a federal offense." "I stood up to retrieve my property," David said, holding out his hand. "My phone." Miller didn't give it back. Instead, he walked over to the cockpit door and grabbed the interphone. "Security to the aircraft. Immediately. I have a disruptive passenger in first class who is refusing crew instructions and exhibiting threatening behavior." He hung up and turned back to David with a smug grin. "You're done. You're off my flight." David sat back down slowly. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He looked at Miller with a mixture of pity and resolve. He had seen pilots burn out before, but this was different. This was malice. "You're making a mistake, Captain," David said quietly. "The only mistake was letting you board," Miller retorted. "People like you don't respect authority. You think you can buy a ticket and act however you want? Well, not on my watch. People like me, David asked. You know exactly what I mean. Miller said, his voice low and venomous. You don't belong in this cabin, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The sound of heavy boots echoed from the jet bridge. 2 Port Authority police officers appeared at the door. Is there a problem here, Captain? The lead officer asked. Yes. Miller pointed a finger at David. Him. He's aggressive. He's refusing to follow safety instructions regarding carry-on luggage, and he physically intimidated me. I want him removed. The officers looked at David. They saw a middle-aged black man in a hoodie sitting calmly with his hands in his lap. They looked at the captain, who was red-faced and sweating. Sir, the officer said to David, we need you to grab your things and come with us. I haven't done anything, David stated clearly. Ask the flight attendant. Ask the other passengers. The officer looked at Sarah. She opened her mouth to speak, but Miller stepped between them. I am the captain. Under FAA regulations, if I determine a passenger is a threat to the safety of the flight, he is removed. Are you questioning my authority, officer? The officer sighed. He knew the drill. The captain had final say on the aircraft. Even if the captain was being a jerk, the plane didn't move until he was happy. Sir, let's just sort this out on the jet bridge, the officer said to David, his tone apologetic. Please. David looked at Miller. The captain was beaming with arrogance, his chest puffed out. He had won. He had exerted his will and crushed the anomaly. David stood up. He reached into the overhead bin and retrieved his duffel bag. He took his phone back from the side table where Miller had tossed it. Very well, David said. He looked at the other passengers. I apologize for the delay, folks. He turned to Miller. You have just initiated a sequence of events. You cannot stop, Captain Miller. Miller laughed. Get off my plane. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. David walked off the plane, flanked by the officers. Miller turned to the cabin, clapping his hands together. All right. Now that the trash has been taken out, we can get underway. Sarah Champagne for everyone in first class on the house. Let's get this bird in the air. He walked back into the cockpit, slamming the door. On the jet bridge, the cool air hit David's face. The officers walked him a few yards away from the plane door. Look, buddy, the officer said. I'm sorry about that. Some of these pilots think they're God. We'll just process you, get you a refund, and put you on the next flight. David stopped walking. He set his duffel bag down on the metal floor of the bridge. There won't be a next flight, David said. And that plane isn't going anywhere. What do you mean? The officer asked, confused. David reached into the inner pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open. The gold badge of the Federal Aviation Administration gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Below it was an ID card that read, David Mercer, Regional Director, Office of Aviation Safety, Inspector General Level 4. The officer's eyes widened. He looked from the badge to David's face. I am formally grounding Flight 802, David said, his voice carrying the weight of the entire U.S. government. And I'm initiating an immediate emergency revocation of Captain Grant Miller's medical and flight certificates, pending an investigation into gross misconduct and psychological instability. He looked at the officer. I need you to escort me back onto that aircraft, and I need you to call the airport duty manager, now. The officer swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. David straightened his hoodie. It was time for the captain to meet the real authority. Captain Grant Miller was feeling good. The adrenaline of the confrontation had settled into a smug satisfaction. He sat in the left seat, adjusting the trim wheel, feeling like the king of his domain. He turned to his first officer, Ben Reynolds. See, Ben, that's how you handle a situation. Miller said, taking a sip of his coffee. You have to be decisive. You can't let people walk all over you. That guy was trouble from the minute he walked on. Probably had a stolen credit card. Ben kept his eyes on the flight management computer, his jaw tight. He seemed calm to me, Grant. Maybe we should have just checked the bag and moved on. We're already 20 minutes late. Better late than flying with a security risk, Miller scoffed. And don't question my judgment in front of the crew again. I noted that, Ben. Don't think I didn't. Ben didn't reply. He just wanted this flight to be over. Suddenly the noise of the jet bridge moving away, which they were expecting, didn't happen. Instead, there was a heavy thud of boots returning to the aircraft. Miller frowned. What now? Did they forget his other bag? He spun his chair around as the cockpit door, which had been left ajar for the purser, was pushed open fully. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the gate agent. It was the Port Authority officer. And right behind him, stepping back onto the plane with the calm demeanor of a grim reaper, was David Mercer. Miller's face turned a violent shade of purple. He unbuckled his harness and stood up, ducking his head under the low ceiling of the flight deck. "Are you deaf?" Miller shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I said get him off, officer. Why is this man back on my aircraft? I will have your badge for this. I want him arrested for trespassing." The officer didn't flinch. In fact, he looked at Miller with a strange expression, one of warning. He stepped aside, allowing David to stand directly in the cockpit doorway. "I am not trespassing, Captain," David said. His voice was no longer the soft rumble of a tired traveler. It was the projected commanding voice of a man used to giving orders that shut down entire airlines. "And this is no longer your aircraft." Miller blinked, confused by the audacity. "Excuse me, I am the pilot in command." "Not anymore," David interrupted. David reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon, but to a pilot it was something far worse. He produced his FAA credentials, flipping the leather wallet open and holding it inches from Miller's face. "David Mercer, Senior Aviation Safety Inspector, badge number 8940 Alpha. I am invoking 14 CFR, Part 13, Section 13.1. David recited the regulation from memory, his eyes locking onto Miller's. "I am formally detaining this aircraft for investigation of safety violations. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate emergency suspension of your Airman Medical Certificate and your Airline Transport Pilot License, effective this second." The silence that followed was suffocating. First Officer Ben Reynolds stopped typing. He swiveled his chair around his eyes wide as he looked at the badge. Every pilot knew the stories of the ghost inspectors, the high-level feds who flew anonymously to catch the worst offenders. He had never seen one in real life. Until now. Miller stared at the gold badge. His brain tried to process the information, but his ego wouldn't let him. You're lying." Miller stammered, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "You're a fake. You printed that off the internet. You think I'm stupid." David didn't argue. He turned to the first officer. "Mr. Reynolds, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Ben squeaked. "Please radio ops," David ordered. "Tell them Inspector Mercer is on board and has grounded the flight. Tell them to send the chief pilot, Captain Henderson, to the aircraft immediately, and tell them to bring a drug and alcohol testing unit." "Alcohol?" Miller shrieked. "I haven't had a drop. This is harassment." "Your erratic behavior, aggression, and dilated pupils suggest otherwise," David said coldly. "Or perhaps it's just a personality disorder incompatible with safe flight operations. Either way, you are unfit to fly." David turned back to the police officer. "Officer, please escort Mr. Miller off the flight deck. He is now a prohibited person in a sensitive security area." Miller looked at the officer, looking for an ally. "You can't do this. I'm the captain." "Sir," the officer said, his hand resting on his belt. "The inspector has jurisdiction here. You need to grab your kit and come with me." "No," Miller shouted, backing up against the instrument panel. "I'm not leaving. This is my plane. I have a schedule to keep." David sighed. He looked at Miller with profound disappointment. "Grant, look at yourself. You are screaming in a cockpit. You are paranoid. You profiled a federal officer because of his clothes and the color of his skin. And now you are disobeying a direct order from the FAA. Every second you resist is another charge on the list. Do you want to go to federal prison, or do you just want to lose your license?" The reality finally hit Grant Miller. It hit him like a bird strike to the windshield. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and ghostly. His hands started to tremble. He looked at the badge again. It was real. The hologram, the embossing, it was real. He had just kicked a federal inspector off his plane for looking like trash. I didn't know," Miller whispered. "Sir, I thought you were—" "You thought I was nobody," David finished for him. "And that's the problem. You think safety and respect are reserved for people who look like you. Get off the flight deck." Miller grabbed his flight bag with shaking hands. He stumbled as he stepped out of the cockpit, his legs feeling like jelly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the nausea of total ruin. The commotion in the cockpit had not gone unnoticed. The curtain separating the galley from the first-class cabin was open. The wealthy couple, the tech CEO, and the other passengers had heard the shouting. They had heard federal inspector and license suspended. When Captain Miller emerged from the front, he wasn't the strutting peacock who had entered moments before. He was a broken man, flanked by a police officer, and the man he had tried to humiliate. David Mercer walked behind him, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder again. He stopped at the front of the cabin. He picked up the PA interphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Inspector Mercer from the Federal Aviation Administration." David's voice boomed through the speakers, calm and authoritative. "I apologize for the disruption and the delay. There has been a change in the flight crew status due to a safety violation. This aircraft is currently grounded while we arrange for a new captain and conduct a mandatory safety audit." He looked at the passengers in first class. He made eye contact with the tech CEO in 2F, the man who had watched Miller berate him without saying a word. The CEO looked down at his shoes, his face burning. "We prioritize your safety above all else," David continued. "Sometimes that means removing hazards before the plane leaves the ground. Thank you for your patience." He hung up the phone. Miller was standing in the aisle, unable to move. He felt the eyes of the passengers on him. The same people he had tried to impress with his tough captain act were now looking at him with mixture of curiosity and disgust. "Move, Miller," the officer nudged him. As they walked up the jet bridge, the atmosphere in the terminal was chaotic. The gate agents were scrambling. The board showed Flight 802. Delayed. Indefinite. Waiting at the top of the jet bridge was a short, stern-looking man in a suit. It was Captain Robert Henderson, the chief pilot for Vista Skies. He had run all the way from the corporate offices in Terminal 1. He saw Miller being escorted by the police. He saw David Mercer. Henderson closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He knew David Mercer by reputation. Mercer was fair, but he was a butcher when it came to incompetence. "Inspector Mercer," Henderson said, extending a hand. "I got the call from Ops. What the hell happened? Captain Henderson." David shook his hand firmly. I'm afraid I had to pull your pilot. Section 44709, Re-examination Order. Plus, I'm filing a formal complaint regarding discrimination and interference with a federal officer's duties. Henderson looked at Miller. Grant, is this true? Miller opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his boss, pleading silently. He tried to have me arrested for having a duffel bag, Bob, David said, using the chief pilot's first name. They had met years ago at a safety conference. He called me trash. He profiled me. And when I tried to show him my credentials digitally, he snatched my phone and accused me of being a drug runner. Henderson's face went hard. He turned to Miller. Give me your badge and your ID. Bob, wait, let me explain. Miller begged, his voice high and desperate. He didn't look like an inspector. He was wearing a hoodie. I was just trying to protect the brand. You protected the brand by harassing the regional director of safety, Henderson snapped. Hand it over, now. With trembling fingers, Miller unclipped his Vista Skies ID and his airport security badge. He handed them to Henderson. Go to the crew room. Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave the airport. The union rep is already on his way. But frankly, Grant, I don't think God himself could get you out of this one, Henderson said. Miller turned to walk away, but David cleared his throat. Actually, Bob, David said, I'd like to conduct the interview now, while the events are fresh. There's a conference room in the admin block, right? Yes. Henderson nodded. Good. Bring him there, and bring his flight logs for the last 6 months. I have a feeling today wasn't an isolated incident. Miller felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The ghost ride wasn't just a random check. David Mercer knew things. The conference room in the Vista Skies administrative suite was sterile white and freezing cold. Captain Grant Miller sat on one side of a long mahogany table. On the other side sat David Mercer, Chief Pilot Henderson, and a frantic-looking union representative named Jerry. David had his laptop open now. He had changed out of his hoodie into a spare blazer he kept in his duffel bag. The transformation was complete. He wasn't the weary traveler anymore. He was the executioner. So, Jerry, the union rep, started trying to salvage the wreckage. My client admits that emotions ran high. He apologizes for the misunderstanding regarding Inspector Mercer's identity. However, we feel that a license revocation is extreme. A suspension and sensitivity training should be sufficient. Jerry, David interrupted softly. Stop. David spun the laptop around so they could see the screen. It displayed a timeline of flight data. I didn't pick Flight 802 by accident, David said. We've had reports on Captain Miller for 8 months. Anonymous tips from co-pilots, ground crew, even air traffic controllers. David clicked a file. An audio waveform appeared. This is from a flight 3 months ago. Miami to JFK. ATC recording. David pressed play. ATC, Vista 409, turn left, heading 300 traffic, 12 o'clock. Miller's voice. Vista 409, we're keeping our heading. I see the cloud. I'm not going around it. Don't tell me how to fly my plane. ATC. Vista 409, that traffic is legitimate. Turn immediately. Miller's voice. I said negative. I'm the captain. David paused the recording. He missed a cargo plane by 400 vertical feet. He never reported the near miss. But the ATC filed a report. We just needed to link the voice to the man. Miller stared at the table. He remembered that day. He had been hungover. He had been angry at his ex-wife. He had taken it out on the controller. And this. David clicked another file. This is a statement from a junior first officer barely out of training. She claims Captain Miller told her that women belong in the galley, not the flight deck, and physically slapped her hand away from the flap lever during a landing in Chicago. Jerry, the union rep, went pale. He looked at Miller. Grant, is that true? You touched a crew member. She was deploying the flaps too early, Miller argued weakly. I was correcting her. You assaulted a subordinate, David corrected. And today you assaulted a passenger's dignity and violated civil rights laws, thinking you were untouchable because of the stripes on your shoulder. David closed the laptop. He leaned forward, clasping his hands. The FAA is not just grounding you, Mr. Miller. We are referring your case to the Department of Justice. The profiling, the intimidation, the falsification of safety reports. This is criminal negligence. Miller began to cry. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. I have a mortgage. My daughter is in private school. Being a pilot is all I know. Please, I'll do anything. I'll fly cargo. I'll fly night shifts. You won't fly anything, David said, his voice hard as granite. Not a Cessna, not a glider, not a drone. You are done. David stood up. He looked at Henderson. Bob, I expect Vista Skies to issue a formal apology to the passengers of Flight 802, and I want a full audit of your HR hiring practices. How a man like this slipped through the cracks for 20 years is a question you need to answer if you want to keep your operating certificate. Understood, David, Henderson said, looking sick. We will cooperate fully. David picked up his bag. He looked at Miller one last time. You know, Grant, David said, if you had just been kind, if you had just treated me like a human being, you might have gotten away with a warning for the bag. You might have kept your job. Your ego cost you your life. David walked out of the room, leaving the sobbing former captain in the cold, fluorescent silence. As David walked back into the terminal, he checked his phone. Flight 802 had been rescheduled. A new crew was on board. He walked to the gate. The same gate agent was there. She looked terrified when she saw him. Mr. Mercer, she gasped. I'm so sorry. If I had known. David smiled gently. You did your job, ma'am. You were polite. You checked my pass. You have nothing to worry about. He looked at the display screen. Boarding. Is there still a seat in 1A? He asked. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. David nodded. Good. I have a flight to catch, and this time I hope the pilot focuses on the clouds, not my clothes. The fall of Captain Grant Miller didn't happen in a vacuum. In the modern age, privacy is an illusion, especially when you scream at a calm man in a confined space filled with bored, affluent people holding smartphones. By the time David Mercer's replacement flight touched down in London, a video titled Pilot Meltdown tries to kick FAA director off plane for looking poor had already amassed 4 million views on Twitter. The tech CEO in seat 2F, a man named Brian Connolly, had recorded the entire interaction from the moment Miller demanded David's phone. The angle was perfect. It showed David's stoic calm and Miller's vein-popping rage. It captured the exact moment the badge came out, a moment the internet was calling the golden flash. When Miller left the airport that day, stripped of his credentials, he thought the worst was over. He thought he could hire a lawyer, wait for the suspension to lift, and maybe move to a cargo airline in Asia. He went home to his sprawling house in Long Island, poured himself a stiff drink, and turned on the TV. He dropped the glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, much like his future. His face was on CNN. The chyron read, "Airline captain investigated for racial profiling and misconduct. His phone began to ring. It wasn't his friends. It was reporters. It was hate mail. It was his ex-wife asking why their daughter was being bullied on social media about her racist dad. The FAA moved faster than Miller anticipated. Usually, investigations took months. But with David Mercer, the regional director, as the primary witness and victim, the red tape was cut with a machete. 2 weeks later, the formal hearing took place at the FAA regional office in Jamaica, Queens. Miller walked in wearing a suit that suddenly looked too big for him. He had lost 15 pounds. He looked sleepless, his eyes sunken and darting around the room. He was accompanied by a high-priced defense attorney, Arthur Penhaligon, known for saving white-collar criminals. On the other side of the table sat a panel of 3 administrative law judges, and sitting in the witness chair, looking indistinguishable from the man on the plane, except for the suit he now wore, was David Mercer. The hearing was brutal. Penhaligon tried to paint Miller as a stressed veteran, suffering from situational fatigue. He argued that Miller's actions were a misjudgment of security protocols rather than malice. My client was protecting the aircraft, Penhaligon argued smoothly. In a post-9/11 world, vigilance is a virtue. Captain Miller merely saw an anomaly and acted, perhaps too zealously, but with good intentions. Then the lead judge called David to speak. David didn't raise his voice. He adjusted the microphone and looked directly at Miller. "I have been in aviation for 30 years, David said. I have investigated crashes where pilots died trying to save their passengers. I have seen heroism. What I saw on Flight 802 was not vigilance. It was vanity." David opened a folder. "The defense claims situational fatigue, but I have the toxicology report from the day of the incident. Captain Miller tested positive for amphetamines, likely diet pills used to stay awake, and his sleep logs show he had been awake for 22 hours, having picked up an extra rotation to pay for a new boat." The room gasped. Miller put his head in his hands. "He wasn't protecting the plane," David continued mercilessly. "He was high on stimulants, sleep-deprived, and operating on a bias that assumes a black man in a hoodie cannot possibly afford a first-class ticket. That is not a misjudgment. That is a hazard. If he had flown that plane with that mindset and that chemical imbalance, 300 people might not have made it to London." The judgment came down 3 days later. It was a scorched earth ruling. 1. Permanent revocation. Grant Miller's airline transport pilot certificate was revoked for life. He would never fly a commercial aircraft again. 2. Civil penalty. A fine of $50,000 for interference with a federal officer. 3. Blacklist. His name was added to the pilot records database with a do not hire flag that no airline insurance company would ever touch. But the hardest hit came from Vista Skies. Desperate to save their stock price, which had plummeted 12% after the video went viral, they sued Miller for breach of contract and reputational damages. They went after his pension. 6 months after the incident, Grant Miller stood in the driveway of his Long Island home. A for sale sign was planted in the lawn. The Porsche was gone. The boat was gone. His friends, the fair-weather ones who liked the captain's parties, were gone. He was 52 years old. He had no degree, no other skills, and a face that everyone recognized as that terrible pilot. He loaded the last box into a rented U-Haul. He wasn't moving to a condo. He was moving to a 1-bedroom apartment in a rusting suburb of Pennsylvania, where the rent was cheap and nobody knew who he was. As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror. He thought about David Mercer. He realized with a sickening jolt that the man in seat 1A hadn't destroyed him. Mercer had just held up a mirror. Miller had destroyed himself. 3 years had passed since the incident on Flight 802. The winter in Scranton, Pennsylvania, was unforgiving. It wasn't just cold. It was a brutal, bone-deep freeze that seemed to seep through the corrugated metal walls of the Depot Logistics warehouse. The wind howled through the gaps in the loading bay doors, carrying with it the grit and grey dust of the industrial park. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and unwashed bodies. For the morning shift crew, the day had begun at 4:00 a.m., long before the sun had even thought about rising over the Pocono Mountains. "Miller, you're dragging on. Bay 4. Let's go, let's go." The voice belonged to Jason, a 24-year-old shift supervisor with a patchy beard and a desperate need to feel important. He paced the concrete floor, clutching a clipboard like it was a scepter of command. "I'm moving Jason." Grant Miller grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He bent his knees and heaved a 50-pound box of automotive alternators onto a wooden pallet. A sharp, hot pain shot through his lower back, a constant companion these days. Grant straightened up slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a glove that was worn through at the thumb. At 55, Grant looked a decade older. The silver hair that had once been coiffed to perfection was now thinning and hidden beneath a cheap knitted beanie. His face, once smooth and flushed with the easy confidence of a man who commanded million-dollar machines, was now etched with deep lines of exhaustion and resignation. The arrogance had been sand-blasted away, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He wore a stained neon yellow safety vest over a frayed flannel shirt and steel-toed boots that pinched his toes. He was a ghost in his own life. The other men at the warehouse, mostly kids out of high school or drifters looking for quick cash, didn't know who he was. They knew he used to work at an airport, but they assumed he had been a baggage handler or maybe a mechanic who got laid off. Grant never corrected them. The truth was too heavy to carry. To tell them he used to be a senior captain for Vista Skies, that he used to dine in Paris and wake up in Tokyo, would only invite questions he couldn't answer. "Why are you here?" then they would ask, and he would have to say, "Because I destroyed my own life in 5 minutes." The lunch buzzer blared a harsh mechanical shriek that echoed off the metal rafters. Grant didn't join the others in the break room, where the heat was turned up too high and the television blared daytime talk shows. He couldn't stand the noise. Instead, he grabbed his metal lunchbox and walked out to the loading dock. He sat on a frozen concrete block, shielded from the wind by a stack of empty pallets. He unwrapped a sandwich bologna on white bread dry. He ate mechanically, staring out at the grey, slush-covered parking lot. He pulled his phone from his pocket. It was an old model with a spiderweb crack across the screen, a far cry from the latest tech he used to upgrade to every year. He connected to the warehouse's spotty Wi-Fi and scrolled through the news, his thumb hovering over the headlines. A banner ad caught his eye, followed by a headline on an aviation news site. He still tortured himself by visiting FAA Safety Director David Mercer, retires after 35 years of service. Grant stopped chewing. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in 3 years, but it was etched into his nightmares. It was the name that marked the boundary between his life before and his life after. With a trembling finger, he tapped the link. The article was a glowing tribute to a legendary career. It detailed Mercer's unshakable integrity, the thousands of lives he had undoubtedly saved through his rigorous inspections and his quiet, stoic dedication to aviation safety. There was a photo of David at his retirement party in Washington, D.C. He was standing at a podium, smiling warmly, surrounded by a crowd of young pilots, engineers, and safety officers. They looked at him with reverence. Grant zoomed in on the photo. David looked older too, his hair fully grey now, but his eyes were bright. He looked at peace. Grant scrolled down to the comments section, a habit he knew he should break but couldn't. A true hero of the industry. Mercer changed the culture of safety. He was tough but fair. I was a young pilot when he inspected me. I was terrified, but he taught me more in 1 hour than I learned in a year of flight school. Grant looked up from the screen, his vision blurring. A lump formed in his throat, hard and painful. He wasn't crying for his lost job. He was crying because he finally understood what he had attacked that day. He hadn't just insulted a passenger. He had tried to humiliate a man who was the very best of what the industry represented. A low rumble began to vibrate in the air. Grant looked up at the overcast sky. Through a break in the heavy grey clouds, he saw it. A wide-body jet, a Boeing 707, climbing steadily towards the east. It was just a tiny silver speck, leaving a white contrail. But Grant knew everything about it. He knew the flight path, probably out of JFK or Newark, heading for London or Frankfurt. He closed his eyes and inhaled sharply. For a second, he wasn't smelling diesel and garbage. He was smelling the unique scent of a flight deck, the recycled air, the ozone from the avionics, the faint aroma of brewing coffee. He could feel the hum of the engines in his hands, the way the yoke felt during a heavy ascent. God, he missed it. He missed it with a physical ache that was sharper than his bad back. He remembered the moment in the cockpit the last time he had sat in the left seat. He remembered the badge. He remembered David's words echoing through time. If you had just been kind, if you had just treated me like a human being, you might have gotten away with a warning. That was the hard karma of it. It wasn't the violation of the rules that had killed his career. It was the cruelty. It was the ego. If he had just smiled, if he had checked the bag and moved on, he would be up there right now, commanding that vessel heading toward the sunrise. "Miller, break's over. Get your ass back in here." Jason's voice shattered the memory. Grant wiped his eyes quickly with his rough sleeve. "Coming," he called back, his voice cracking. He stood up, his knees popping, and brushed the crumbs from his neon vest. He wasn't Captain Miller. He was just Miller, the guy who loaded boxes. He turned to head back inside, resigned to another 5 hours of lifting and silence. But as he reached for the door handle, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black sedan had pulled into the visitor's lot, looking wildly out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and battered hatchbacks of the warehouse workers. The car stopped near the chain-link fence that separated the lot from the loading dock. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a long, tailored wool coat and a scarf against the biting wind. He stood with a posture that was upright and commanding yet relaxed. Grant froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt like he might vomit. It was David Mercer. Grant's first instinct was to run, to duck back inside the warehouse and hide among the towering shelves of inventory. Had Mercer come to gloat? Had he come to see the wreckage he had caused, to kick the trash while he was down? But David had already seen him. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He simply locked eyes with Grant and walked slowly toward the fence. Grant couldn't move. His feet felt leaden. Slowly, draggingly, he walked toward the fence until only the wire mesh separated them. "Mr. Mercer," Grant croaked. His voice was barely a whisper. "Grant!" David nodded. His voice was the same deep, calm baritone that Grant remembered. "I was in the area, visiting my daughter in Philly. I heard you were working here." Grant looked down at his boots. "You checked up on me. I keep tabs on all my major cases," David said. His eyes swept over Grant, taking in the fingerless gloves, the stained vest, the tired, defeated posture. He didn't see a monster anymore. He didn't see the arrogant tyrant who had screamed at him on Flight 802. He saw a man serving a life sentence of regret. "I suppose you're happy," Grant said bitterly, risking a glance upward. "Look at me. I'm loading pallets for minimum wage. Justice is served right." "I don't take pleasure in ruin, Grant," David said softly. The wind whipped his coat, but he didn't shiver. "I take pleasure in safety, and the skies are safer. But I didn't come here to lecture you. You've clearly lectured yourself enough." Grant let out a shaky breath. "Then why are you here?" David reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Grant flinched, an involuntary reflex from the last time David had reached into his pocket. But this time there was no badge. David pulled out a small, cream-colored business card. He slid it through the diamond gap in the chain-link fence. "There's a small flight school in Jersey," David said. "Simtech Aviation. The owner is an old friend of mine from the Air Force. They're looking for a simulator instructor." Grant stared at the card. It was hovering there, white against the grey backdrop of the warehouse. "A simulator instructor," Grant repeated, confused. "Ground school only. No flying. You can't hold a license, and that hasn't changed." David explained, his tone strictly professional. "But your knowledge of the 707 systems, the flows, the checklists, the emergency procedures, that is still valid. You were a capable pilot, Grant, technically speaking. You just forgot the human element." Grant looked from the card to David's face. I don't understand. My friend needs someone who knows the aircraft inside and out. I told him you know the bird better than anyone," David said. He paused, his expression softening just a fraction. "I also told him that if you show even a hint of your old temper, he should fire you on the spot. But if you can be humble, if you can teach these kids not just how to fly, but how to be professionals, then you have something to offer." "Why?" Grant whispered, tears spilling over onto his cold cheeks. "After what I did to you, I treated you like dirt. I tried to have you arrested. Because everyone deserves a path to redemption, Grant," David said. "You were a bad man that day, but you don't have to be a bad man forever. Maybe teaching the next generation how to avoid your mistakes is the only way to balance the ledger." David turned up his collar against the wind. "It pays better than this place, and it's warm inside." David turned and walked back to his car, his shoes crunching on the frozen gravel. He didn't look back. He got in. The engine purred to life, and the black sedan pulled away, disappearing down the grey road. Grant stood there for a long time. The wind howled around him, biting at his exposed ears. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel the cold. He looked at the card in his trembling hand. Simtech Aviation. Senior Instructor. He looked back at the warehouse. He could hear Jason shouting his name again. "Miller, where the hell are you?" Grant looked at the dark, gaping maw of the loading dock. Then he looked at the card. A spark, tiny and fragile, flickered to life in his chest. It wasn't pride. It was hope. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the icy air. He gripped the card tight like a lifeline. "I'm right here," Grant whispered to himself. He turned his back on the pallets, the neon vest, and the bitter cold of Scranton. He walked toward the manager's office, not with a strut, but with a steady, humble purpose. He was going to quit. And then he was going to go teach. The story of Captain Grant Miller and Inspector David Mercer is a chilling reminder that authority is not a license to bully. In a world where we are quick to judge based on appearances, we often forget that the person we are mistreating might be the very person holding the keys to our future. Grant Miller learned the hard way that true power isn't about the stripes on your shoulder or the seat you occupy. It's about character, humility, and respect. He lost everything to learn that lesson. But in the end, even the trash he tried to remove offered him a hand up. It proves that while karma is real and can be devastating, redemption is always possible if you are willing to shed your ego and do the work. Wow, what a journey. From the height of arrogance in the cockpit to the humbling reality of a warehouse floor. This story shows that you never really know who you're talking to. If you enjoyed this dramatic twist of karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you have done if you were in David Mercer's seat? Would you have offered Miller a second chance at the end? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story of arrogance meeting its match. Thanks for watching and stay safe out there.